Queen Camilla's private financial team initiated a quiet, aggressive audit of the late Queen Elizabeth II's private off-book sovereign wealth, attempting to execute one of the most audacious transfers of capital in modern royal history. Their ultimate goal was to utilize an archaic legal loophole to claim a massive multi-million-pound share of the late monarch's private estate for Camilla's personal unrestricted use. But Camilla and her elite financial advisors made one fatal, irreversible error in their calculations. They completely forgot that Queen Elizabeth II was a constitutional grandmaster who spent her entire life staying 5 steps ahead of everyone in her own household. Before her passing, the late monarch quietly and systematically locked her multi-billion-pound private portfolio inside an impenetrable, highly classified generational trust. This extraordinary legal fortress bypassed King Charles and Queen Camilla, entirely transferring the unchallengeable ownership of the sovereign wealth directly and solely to Princess Charlotte. Before we examine the specific bloodline protection clauses buried inside that secret trust, make sure you hit the subscribe button, because the level of tactical warfare currently playing out in the palace archives is completely unprecedented and reveals exactly how the future of the monarchy is being secured in the shadows. To understand the sheer magnitude of the capital that Camilla was attempting to seize, you have to understand the complex, multi-layered architecture of royal wealth in the United Kingdom. When a British sovereign passes away, their estate is divided into 2 distinctly separate categories: the state-owned assets, which include the sprawling crown estate, the sovereign palaces, and the royal collection of art and jewels, remain permanently bound to the institution of the monarchy, transferring automatically to the reigning successor to be held in trust for the nation. However, the private personal wealth of the monarch is an entirely different entity, built over decades of highly confidential investing. This off-book portfolio includes private blue-chip stock holdings, massive tracts of international real estate, lucrative agricultural lands, private race-horse studs, and independent inheritances passed down through generations of the royal family. Settling this off-book estate is an incredibly delicate, highly secretive legal process that typically takes several years of quiet forensic accounting conducted far away from the scrutiny of Parliament or the public. It was during this quiet transitional administrative phase that Queen Camilla's private office identified a historic opportunity to cement her family's financial supremacy. Her chief financial officer, coordinating closely with the keeper of the privy purse, formally requested a comprehensive, unredacted audit of Queen Elizabeth's private investment portfolios. The legal justification that Camilla's attorneys invoked to demand this audit was not based on modern inheritance law. Instead, they weaponized an archaic medieval legal doctrine known as the Consort Dower Right, originally established centuries ago to ensure that a queen consort would not be left financially destitute and politically vulnerable if her husband passed away before her. This ancient prerogative theoretically allows a reigning consort to lay claim to a specific percentage, historically up to 15%, of the private non-state wealth of the predecessor monarch, provided that the capital is explicitly used for the independent operational support of the consort's household. On the surface, Camilla's team meticulously framed this aggressive financial maneuver as a progressive charitable step forward. They drafted elaborate proposals for the creation of the Queen Consort's Community Development Fund, a new philanthropic vehicle that would supposedly use the inherited millions to fund grassroots charities supporting vulnerable women and children across the Commonwealth. It was a flawless, legally sound public relations shield. It made the massive audit look like a noble, forward-thinking endeavor designed to modernize the royal family's charitable reach, insulating Camilla from any internal accusations of greed or overreach. But when you strip away the philanthropic language and examine the secret minutes of the planning sessions held at Clarence House, the true, deeply strategic motive behind this audit becomes undeniably clear. Camilla's primary objective was never charity. Her ultimate goal was the complete systematic neutralization of Prince William and Catherine's growing financial independence. Since William ascended to the title of Prince of Wales, he has assumed direct, unchallengeable control of the Duchy of Cornwall. This massive £12 billion historical estate generates over £30 million of private liquid income annually. This staggering financial independence has allowed William and Catherine to operate with immense freedom, building their own private households, funding their own independent initiatives, and hiring their own top-tier strategic advisors, completely free from the financial control of the king's central household. Camilla viewed this rising independence as a direct existential threat to her own influence within the court. By attempting to seize 15% of Queen Elizabeth's private estate, a sum estimated by independent forensic accountants to be worth upwards of £1.5 billion. Camilla was attempting to build her own massive private financial counterweight. She wanted an unrestricted war chest that would allow her to fund her own political alliances, reward her loyalists, and maintain absolute dominance over the aristocratic hierarchy long after her husband's reign eventually comes to an end. More crucially, Camilla's financial strategy involved a highly sophisticated psychological attempt to hold the next generation of the royal family hostage. Her legal team proposed that as part of the estate settlement, the minor trust funds destined for Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis be brought under the joint administrative control of the Central Palace Board, rather than remaining under Prince William's exclusive custody. Camilla's lawyers argued that because Charlotte and Louis are minor descendants of the reigning monarch, their future household funding, educational allocations, and eventual staff security details should be subject to the approval of the Queen Consort's centralized administrative office. It was a calculated, brutal attempt to force William and Catherine into a position of absolute financial dependency. If Camilla successfully absorbed the minor trusts into her newly enriched central fund, Catherine would be forced into a position of subservience. The Princess of Wales would have to seek her stepmother's written permission and financial approval for every single major decision regarding her children's development, education, and public roles. King Charles, deeply exhausted by the physical toll of his ongoing medical treatments and desperate to maintain domestic peace within his own household, simply signed the authorization documents allowing the audit to proceed. He was completely unaware that by granting his wife permission to open the financial ledgers, he was paving the path to a trap designed to subjugate his own grandchildren. But Camilla's legal team and her ambitious financial advisors had absolutely no idea that their meticulously planned audit was about to collide head-on with a legal fortress designed by Queen Elizabeth II in the final quiet weeks of her life. In August 2022, as the late Queen sat in her private study at Balmoral Castle, her physical health was rapidly declining, but her legendary understanding of constitutional law and family dynamics remained completely flawless. She had spent 70 years observing the subtle, dangerous shifts in power within her own family, and she possessed an unvarnished, highly realistic view of the characters who would inherit her court. She knew that her son's reign would be transitional, heavily defined by his own health struggles and his deep reliance on his wife. More importantly, she saw the aggressive long-term ambitions of Camilla's biological family, the Parker Bowles network, who had spent decades slowly integrating themselves into the periphery of royal power. The Queen knew that the moment her hand left the sovereign signet, the financial independence of William's children would become a primary target for those seeking to consolidate control. Acting with absolute secrecy, Queen Elizabeth quietly summoned the executive board of Coutts and Company to a closed-door meeting at the Scottish estate. Coutts is not a standard high street bank. They have been the royal family's private, highly secretive wealth managers since the 18th century, operating with a level of discretion that rivals the National Intelligence Services, bypassing the standard Crown estate lawyers, the central government solicitors, and the King's future advisors entirely. The Queen executed a highly classified, legally binding instrument known in the highest echelons of wealth management as a sovereign generational trust. The statutory language of the sovereign generational trust was engineered with a brutal, uncompromising simplicity that left absolutely no room for future legal interpretation. The document took the entirety of Elizabeth II's private off-book stock portfolios, her international real estate holdings, her private sovereign investments, and her accumulated liquid capital, and placed them inside an impenetrable multi-generational vault. The core clause of the trust contained a highly specific, irrevocable bloodline restriction. It stipulated in exacting legal terminology that under no circumstances could any portion of the private estate be transferred to, managed by, audited by, or used to fund any non-bloodline spouse who married into the Windsor family. The clause effectively legally blinded the Queen Consort's office, preventing them from even accessing the banking ledgers to view the assets. But the true devastating genius of the trust lies in the specific designation of the primary beneficiary. Elizabeth II did not leave the billions to Charles, knowing that doing so would immediately expose the capital to Camilla's dower claims and the Central Palace's administrative grasp. She did not even leave the capital to William, directly knowing that as the heir to the throne, he would face intense institutional pressure to absorb the funds into the general Crown estate to offset public spending. Instead, utilizing a sophisticated skipping transfer mechanism, she legally bound the unchallengeable ownership of the entire private portfolio to the second-born female descendant of the direct line of succession, Princess Charlotte. By using this highly specific constitutional designation, Queen Elizabeth II ensured that the private wealth biases the current reign entirely. Because the capital skipped a generation and was placed directly into a minor's independent trust, it cannot be heavily taxed under standard sovereign-to-sovereign exemption rules, and it is entirely insulated from the legal reach of King Charles or Queen Camilla. To ensure the money remained actively protected, the trust document explicitly named Prince William and Princess Anne as the sole co-fiduciary trustees. The Queen intentionally selected her most ruthless duty-bound children to act as the financial guardians. The document granted William and Anne the absolute unchallengeable authority to manage, invest, and shield the funds on Charlotte's behalf until she reaches her majority age. William and Anne have known about the existence of the sovereign generational trust since the day it was signed at Balmoral. They have been sitting quietly in the shadows for years, holding the keys to an offshore multi-billion-pound financial shield, simply waiting for Queen Camilla's office to make the exact arrogant mistake they made this week by demanding an audit. Camilla believed she was opening a vault to claim a billion-pound fortune that would secure her family's dominance for decades. Instead, she was about to walk into a legal ambush that would leave her financially empty-handed and painfully aware that the true power of the British monarchy has already skipped past her entirely. The culmination of this high-stakes financial war did not play out in a courtroom or on the pages of the public ledger. It was resolved on a cold, overcast Thursday afternoon inside the historic Green Drawing Room at Windsor Castle, a space chosen specifically for its absolute privacy, far from the prying eyes of the wider household staff. King Charles sat at the head of a massive, polished mahogany table, looking visibly drained, his hand resting near a stack of transfer documents prepared by Queen Camilla's lawyers. Camilla stood just behind his chair, her face radiating a quiet, triumphant confidence, flanked by her chief legal advisor, Sir Marcus Vance. They were gathered to execute the final official signature that would ratify her Consort Dower claim, transferring 15% of Queen Elizabeth's private off-book estate directly into her newly established philanthropic foundation. Sir Marcus Vance held the pen ready to hand it to the king, believing they were merely moments away from securing a historic billion-pound financial empire for Camilla's family. The heavy double doors of the drawing room did not open with a dramatic flourish. They opened quietly, and Prince William and Princess Anne walked in completely unannounced. They did not come alone. Walking directly between them was the chief executive officer of Coutts and Company Bank, carrying a secured red leather dispatch box bearing the personal cipher of the late Queen. The sudden uninvited entrance of the Princess Royal, the Prince of Wales, and the head of the royal family's private banking institution caused an immediate palpable freeze to sweep through the room. Sir Marcus Vance lowered his pen, his face tightening with a sudden, deep sense of apprehension. Camilla's confident posture stiffened, her eyes locking onto the red dispatch box with a mixture of confusion and sudden alarm. William did not raise his voice. He did not engage in an emotional argument, nor did he offer any dramatic proclamations. He simply walked to the opposite end of the mahogany table, stood perfectly still, with his hands clasped behind his back, and gestured to the chief executive of Coutts and Company. The bank executive stepped forward, unlocked the red dispatch box with a gold key, and extracted a certified, heavily sealed document. He did not look at Camilla or her attorneys. He looked directly at King Charles and began to read the formal statutory declaration of the Sovereign Generational Trust, executed by Queen Elizabeth II in August 2022. The reading of the document was a clinical, devastating execution of royal authority. The bank executive read the precise, unyielding clauses of the trust, explaining that the entirety of Queen Elizabeth's private off-book investment portfolios, valued at over £1.5 billion, had already departed the accessible general estate. The capital had been permanently transferred into a private generational trust and frozen in real time. He then read the direct bloodline restriction stating that under the absolute mandate of the late sovereign, no non-bloodline spouse could ever hold, manage, or benefit from these funds. The executive concluded by reading the primary beneficiary clause. He officially informed the room that the sole unilateral owner of the late Queen's private wealth was Princess Charlotte of Wales, with Prince William and Princess Anne designated as the sole fiduciary trustees. William looked across the table at his stepmother, his voice carrying the cold, flat finality of an absolute legal checkmate. "My daughter is the sole beneficiary of my grandmother's private estate," William said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "These funds are locked in an independent sovereign trust that is entirely outside the jurisdiction of the Crown Estate or the Central Palace Administration. Your consort dower claim is legally invalid, and there is no capital left in the private estate for you to audit." Camilla stood entirely frozen at the head of the table, her hands visibly trembling as she gripped the back of Charles's chair, her face completely drained of color. She looked at Sir Marcus Vance, her eyes silently pleading with him to find a loophole, to mount a defense, to tell her that this document could be fought in the courts, but her chief legal adviser could only stare down at the mahogany table in absolute paralyzed silence. He knew that a sovereign generational trust, sealed under the High Court of Chancery and personally executed by Queen Elizabeth II with Coutts and Company, was completely impenetrable. There was no appeal process, there was no negotiation. Camilla's sister and her financial team had spent months planning a historic billion-pound acquisition, and in less than 5 minutes they had been left with absolutely nothing. The fallout of this defeat was immediate and catastrophic for Camilla's faction within the palace. The Queen Consort's Community Development Fund, which had been heavily promoted as her signature philanthropic legacy, was suddenly left completely empty, lacking the vital injection of capital required to launch its operations. The high-profile public relations firms and aristocratic advisors she had recruited to manage the fund were left unpaid, their lucrative contracts abruptly cancelled. Her carefully constructed network of influence within the London elite began to fracture instantly, as her allies realized that her supposed financial power was entirely an illusion. She was left politically isolated, her authority severely damaged, and her future financial security entirely dependent on the goodwill of the man whose mother she had spent her life trying to replace. Vua Charles, looking at his mother's signature on the trust document, slowly pushed Camilla's dower papers away. He understood the absolute finality of the trap Elizabeth II had set for them, and he refused to invoke a constitutional crisis to fight a losing battle on behalf of his wife's ambition. A few hours later, far away from the cold tension of Windsor Castle, the atmosphere inside Adelaide Cottage was peaceful and still. The fire was roaring in the private study, casting a warm golden glow against the oak-paneled walls. Prince William sat on the sofa, with 11-year-old Princess Charlotte sitting quietly beside him. William reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the original certified copy of the 2022 Sovereign Succession Protection Act, showing her the elegant, sweeping signature of her great-grandmother. William looked at his daughter, his voice soft, but filled with an unyielding protective certainty. "Your great-grandmother loved you very much, Charlotte," he told her quietly. "She knew that there would be people who would try to control your future, to use your name for their own gain. So, before she left us, she signed this law. She made sure that no one, no matter what title they hold, can ever touch what belongs to you." Charlotte looked up at her father, a small, knowing smile on her face, understanding the silent war that had been fought and won on her behalf. Her future was secured, her independence guaranteed, and the legacy of the women who came before her was completely safe under her father's guard. But while the internal security of the Wales family was now absolute, the chief executive of Coutts and Company had left one final highly confidential folder inside William's study before departing. It was a secondary restricted addendum to the Sovereign Generational Trust that had been kept entirely separate from the financial ledger. When William opened the folder later that evening, the document inside sent an immediate electrifying shockwave through his inner circle. This addendum did not relate to stock portfolios or international real estate. It was a specific legally binding decree regarding the personal jewelry collection of Queen Elizabeth II, specifically focusing on her most iconic and priceless personal heirloom, the Vladimir tiara. If you know royal history, you know that the Vladimir tiara is one of the most culturally significant and visually stunning boulevards in the entire world, featuring 15 cascading circles of brilliant diamonds originally smuggled out of Russia during the Revolution and purchased by Queen Mary. It was Queen Elizabeth's absolute favorite piece, a symbol of her historic reign. Camilla's office had recently submitted a formal requisition request to the master of the jewel house, demanding that the Vladimir tiara be reserved exclusively for her use at an upcoming high-profile state dinner, intending to use it to cement her visual authority as Queen Consort. But the secondary addendum, drafted by Queen Elizabeth II in August 2022, was an absolute preemptive strike against Camilla's aesthetic ambitions. The document stipulated in unequivocal legal terms that the Vladimir tiara was classified as a private personal heirloom of the late sovereign and was to be legally promised, gifted, and held in trust exclusively for Princess Charlotte of Wales. The decree officially ordered that the tiara be removed from the central royal vaults immediately and placed into the secure private custody of Charlotte's legal guardians, William and Catherine, to be held until Charlotte reaches her majority. Camilla had spent months planning to wear the most famous crown in the world to assert her dominance over the court. Instead, she was about to receive a formal, legally binding notification from the master of the jewel house, ordering her to immediately cease all requisition requests for the Vladimir tiara and acknowledging that the heirloom now officially belonged to an 11-year-old girl. William had not just stripped Camilla of her financial war chest, he was about to strip her of her visual crown. The eviction of the Queen Consort's family from the royal assets was complete, and William was already preparing his next move.